Okay guys, today we're looking at musical notation and scores. This is based off of a Key Stage 3 lesson in curriculum. So here we go. So initially we just want to look at what notation score is. So notation scores is anything like sheet music, things that visually represent music that's being played. This can be played by an instrument or even being sung by vocalists. It'll be things like notes or the words, shifts between pitches, that kind of thing. There are many forms of notation which we will go over at a later date or in another video. Just basically, notation is a written form or could be printed, anything that shows a visual representation of this music. This allows for musicians to be able to follow, play along with everything without having so many questions and being unsure of what they're doing. This will be things like the notes, rests, anything that a performer would really need to be able to understand what is going on. Scores, however, are slightly different. Scores are a form of notation. They tend to be written for pianos, things like that. As you can see on the slide currently, there is a example of a score, but scores are also notations. So a simple explanation of what a score is a copy of a composition on a set of staves. So the staves are the 5 horizontal lines that you can see, and then the notes on them are the composition, the thing that has been written, the thing that musicians will read and play. Scores tend to be things like sheet music. There are different versions of scores for different instruments, which we'll also go over at a later date. But it tends to show the notes, the rhythms, the chords, the pitch, that kind of thing. So lots of information, definitely something that is vital, and we will go over all of that soon. Okay guys, so we're going to talk about a brief history of musical notation, different things that happened to have notation the way that we understand it and scores the way that we understand it. So the first ever recorded and found form of notation was found in Iraq in 1400 BC, but it was very basic, fragmented. It was like little lines and symbols, things that only people who understood it would be able to read it. There isn't really a lot of information on this, but that's just the basics of the first one ever found. So over years, notation developed, so more things were added. It could have been like tempo and pitch and chords. They were all added along the way. And it took a long time. It took a very, very long time to get to what we know notation as. So notation, as we said, is a visual representation of music. Therefore, it needed to be recorded somewhere. It could have been written, it could have been printed, it could have been drawn. There are lots of forms of notation so long it's visually represented. In the year 1025, a monk whose name I am unable to pronounce, I have popped it on the slide there if you want to look into that a little bit more. He made a massive contribution to notation and the way we know it today. He thought about finding a way, when he was teaching choirs, how they could sing together perfectly in pitch, in unison, through reading something, so that way when new members arrived they could follow it, or that people who maybe are well versed in choral singing would still be able to follow if it was a song they maybe didn't know. He organised pitches into groups that he called hexachords. He also started the idea of a stave, but back then when he'd written it, the stave was 4 lines, but as we know it still being the notes on and in between lines. One of the 4 lines would be marked as a key indicator. This was how new people arriving or joining or being part of it could find out where the notes were, because his version of notation was not as in each, as we know as each one being a note. There were no specific notes at the time that were recorded. It was a key indicator, so you knew where you were starting, and he created this simply because new members were unable to follow the original writings of it. So based on the key indicator, the symbols that were on his notation, on his score, were written in relative to the notes that they were to sing. So based on the key indicator, his symbols would say either down or up, and round about how far up or down they needed to go, allowing people to follow it a little bit easier. Yeah, so this form of notation that he did was perfect at the time for the people who knew it. However, if you look back on them, and I do have some examples that I will have in another video, the notation is difficult to follow. Musicians didn't really understand the length of notes, and he did, like I said, write it for vocal. It was all for singers. There was no instruments involved in his version of notation, in what he was using notation for. There was just no instruments, it was all vocals. However, finding out what notation is and the fact that it helps so many musicians, it did develop. And around the 17th century, instrumental and classical music was quite a big deal, especially if you were of higher society. This kind of music was something that you listened to quite regularly. It was popular. But musicians had realised that the version of notation that they were trying to use, that the monk wrote, it was limiting, and it started being difficult to figure out how to use that notation in anything else, such as piano or string instruments. It was just not working. So musicians thought to try and refine it, make it work. So what they did is, over time, they started designing bar lines, stylized clefs, dynamic markings, ties, and slurs. They all began to appear on music, which are things that we still see in today's notation and today's version of scores. It's how we follow them. It's how we understand what to play, how long to play, when to play. It's all key and it's all important to being able to write musically. So over the many years that we've been writing, pianists, all of the people that came before us have been writing music, it developed with a new idea. It was sheet music. So they ended up adding an extra line to be a 5-line stave. This allowed for people, especially pianists, that tended to play, that all of their notes were included. We will go over staves and notes later at another time. But yeah, this kind of development of understanding and the history of notation and scores is very important, just to understand the basics and realise where it's all come from. I'm not expecting any of you to remember that off by heart. Just know that the notation and the scores that we have today aren't the way that they've always been. It's been developed. But any form, no matter what it is, if it's visual representation of music, meaning that you can see the notes that are played, or it's got to be visual representation of what's being played. I don't mean like music videos or things that explain what the music is about. It's visual representation of what's being played. So there are YouTube videos out there that show the notes being played in a different form, or like I said, sheet music, tabs for guitar, chord sheets even show music being played. These kinds of things all link to notation and the way in which we read and understand music as musicians. But this is just basically a quick overview of how it became what it is today. Okay, great guys.